Now we all have our favorite set of Pokemon games, mine being Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, as they are remakes of the first ever Pokemon games I played, and them having added to them with many ways to do my favorite activity in the franchise, shiny hunting. This video, however, isn't about how great those titles are, but instead about another set of games within the franchise, an entry that sparked controversy before they ever released. What controversy, you ask? Pokemon going woke? Game Freak firing all their staff, or microtransactions being added to buy Pokemon? No, it was a tree. Yes, one of those objects they claim to exist outside, and this became the vocal point on how these games would suck, how they were rushed, and how we should have never gone to open world 3D Pokemon games. Now, to save you Nintendo bumming nerds the energy of typing a comment, explaining to me how wrong I am and how there was more, I know. Let me get to it. The truth is though, comparatively to many other games, what this game had going against itself pre-release was pretty minor. The graphics looked bad and they removed the national decks, making them the first games to not have all Pokemon available within them, for good reasons I think, and after release they became the second best selling Pokemon games of all time. So 5 years later, I do wonder, were Pokémon Sword and Shield actually that bad, or does the Pokemon community simply lack perspective of what a bad game is? If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more, leave a like and subscribe. Let me know what game I should tackle next, and without further ado, let's talk about it. I think to fully understand this discussion, we actually need to take a step back and start with something non-Pokemon related, the Nintendo Switch. In the grand scheme of things, this platform is amazing. It has sold 141 million units as of me writing this script, making it the best selling Nintendo platform ever and the third best selling console, period. So safe to say, Nintendo cooked with this one. Yet there's one thing that has been blatantly obvious since the release of the platform, and that is the lack of performance. This makes a lot of sense, as the Switch is meant to be a hybrid between a home console and a handheld. To execute this vision, Nintendo had to make concessions to make it possible, and back when the Switch was developed in the early 2010s, it was simply impossible to make it any better than it was with the vision they had in mind. A big counter argument to this quote-unquote excuse by Nintendo fans is that a lot of people bring up the fact that the Steam Deck is a lot better, which it is. But it also went into development about 5 years later. In tech terms, that is an eternity. And a lot of things change in such a short period of time. So I think it's important that we understand the limitations of the platform before we analyze its games. Why is this important for Pokemon? Well, I'm going to piss a lot of people off with this one, but open world-esque Switch games don't look great and never have looked great. Anyone who's ever played a game on PC, the PS4, or Xbox, whatever the fuck it's called now, will instantly notice the lack of graphics and performance on any Switch game, from visual fidelity to lack of frames. It's simply a lot worse, and there's nothing much Nintendo affiliated studios can do about it. Stop typing again, Timmy, because I know you're going to argue that the Zelda games look great, and I hate to break it to you, they don't. They are fantastic games, please don't get that wrong. But graphically, they look very bland, empty, and sometimes even lifeless compared to other games in its genre on more powerful platforms. Yet again, this has nothing to do with the competence of the Zelda team, it's just because the Switch is simply less powerful. Does Pokémon Sword and Shield in certain situations look worse than Zelda? Sure, but worse than bad is still bad, so pick your poison, I suppose. Comparing it to other games like Mario Kart, which renders in a singular level instead of an open world, is a stupid comparison in my opinion, as they use completely different technology to display their worlds. Should Pokemon have used this? Sure, they could have. You could even argue that the best looking places in these games are the ones that have load zones, like the various routes and towns across the game. The only truly bad looking and performing parts of these games are the various wild areas that render in a bigger part of the world at once. But graphics don't really matter, and Zelda actually proves that exact point, because Breath of the Wild showed that a game doesn't need to look stunning to receive incredible reviews, and rightfully so, as it's often regarded by many, including myself, as one of the best games of its generation. If the game is good, then graphics don't really matter. Sure, they help, but Sword and Shield didn't suck for people because of their graphics, and this argument of graphics was just a scapegoat for the unrealistic expectations of the Pokemon fanbase. Remember the lack of perspective I was talking about earlier? This is quite often found within Nintendo fans to begin with, but Pokemon fans are probably up there amongst some of the worst of them. Anyone watching this who has been a fan of Ubisoft, Activision, EA, or any other AAA franchise would laugh at the things Pokemon fans were complaining about. These AAA fans are concerned about way more damaging things to their games than a tree not looking good or having a little less Pokemon to capture. Things like microtransactions, lack of support, sudden unwanted features, or simply the plug being pulled from the game are just amongst a few of the issues that these people would worry about. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying Game Freak is the end all be all best company of them all, in contrary even, as I made an entire video on how I think they're probably one of the most out of touch companies out there, but at least with their games you don't have to deal with all the usual fuckery of a AAA title. With any company, bar Nintendo, the removal of the national decks would have meant massive amounts of microtransactions or region-based DLCs to unlock all Pokemon. With Game Freak, however, it meant, oh, here are 2 DLCs where you can get some more Pokemon, and if you don't own the DLC, you can still trade them with other players or bring them up from all the games to the Pokemon Bank and home. These things don't happen in the AAA space. Get your wallets out, boys, otherwise you're not catching these monsters. So if not to milk its players' wallets, what was the reason for them not allowing you to catch all 900 Pokemon, or at least make them available in one game? Well, it's quite logical, to be honest. They felt like there were simply too many Pokemon. Wait, no. The balancing wasn't right. Fuck, no. It was because of them having to remake all the models and animations for the new games. Yes, that's it. Game Freak never gave a clear reason and even lied to their fans. I'm going to try and break this down as best as I can, as over the years Game Freak has given many explanations on why they removed it, including some lies that have been proven to be true, or false, or whatever it's called when a lie is proven to be a lie. The main reason given around the release of these games by Game Freak was that they had to remake all the animations and models of the Pokemon for this game as they transferred from the 3DS to the Switch, making it unrealistic for them to do all 900 plus at once, so they decided to cut the amount of Pokemon in each game to assure its quality. Makes sense, until you break it down. Pokemon went from 3D sprites to 3D models during the Generation 6 games X and Y, when they switched from the original DS to the 3DS. To make this happen, they had to remodel all 721 Pokemon at the time and their animations, which was a huge undertaking, and quite frankly, they did a pretty decent job at it. So let me ask you this. If you remodel all these Pokemons a few years before the Sword and Shield development started, which company in their right mind would do it again? As at the time of these remodelings, you would have probably already figured out that there's no 4D modeling, so doing this right once means that you would be set up for the future. Something Game Freak even said themselves when they did so back when X and Y released. Okay, sure, if you really care about your games, you probably should remodel these Pokemons with new technology every few years. But if you want to release a yearly Pokemon game, which Game Freak wants, then no executive in their right mind would ever sign off on such a dumb idea, and they didn't. Because Game Freak actually lied about them not redoing all models and animations. Not just because of the logic I just presented, but because people have actually proven it as seen on screen. So what was the real reason then? Well, balancing is a part of it, as they mentioned that balancing a competitive scene and general battling around all 900 Pokemon is ridiculously difficult, and it is, but I still don't think that was the full reason. Before we move on to my own theory, I do want to pose one counter argument to them lying, and that is the fact that the article where Game Freak claims to have redone all the models from scratch was translated from Japanese and was done so rather poorly. In reality, they claimed that they would spruce up some models and improve the fidelity of them and the various animations they felt like were lacking. Now, judging by the many comparisons made between the previous and quote-unquote new models and animations, not much has truly improved. So in reality, they might have not lied, but just simply have done a poor job at it. My theory, judging from the various interviews I've read, is that they simply just didn't want to overcrowd the games to make you actually care for the Pokemon that were in there. Of course, a part of it is also to incentivize you to buy their next games to play with your favorite Pokemon again, but I mainly feel like it has more to do with you actually caring about the Pokemon and creating an attachment to these games. If you can catch every early bird Pokemon on Route 1, you'd probably pick the strongest or the coolest looking one, so the new Rookidee then either has to be that or you wouldn't care for it. Instead, it's the only early bird Pokemon, so you kind of have to deal with it and form a connection with it. What if we had Bidoof on the same route as Patrat in Black and White? Would you ever not catch the god himself? Of course you would. It's important for a game like Pokemon to force you to create new bonds and memories with the new Pokemon they introduce, so you stay invested into their franchise. If you can play with the same 6 favorites or strongest Pokemon every year, then the games will get stale really quickly. If I think about this game, I think about going on Route 1 and meeting Wooloo and Rookidee for the first time, just like how I remember Bidoof and Starly from Diamond and Pearl. And yes, I know that in the older titles not all Pokemon were catchable, but obtainable. With 900 of them now, an online scene and other factors, it makes it a lot more complicated than just add them, bro. For example, competitive balancing. Imagine if people had a Pokemon you couldn't obtain. You'd be pissed. But Game Freak lied about them redoing animations and models and giving weird reasons, when I'm truly convinced my theory is the actual one. Why lie then? Well, I think that they tried to consolidate as they were getting a lot of backlash early on about the graphics and the lack of possible content of the game. Speaking of content, we spoke about all the content they don't have, but what content does it actually have? Take a shot for every time I say content. Content. Hate me already? Good. Let's move on. Overall, these games were like any other Pokemon games in the franchise, and quite frankly, the point where they should have drawn a line with their open world ideas. Let me explain. Sword and Shield had these things called wild areas. Bigger open areas that were fully open world and you could explore to your heart's content. Well, depending on how far along the game you were, as certain areas were blocked off depending on how many gym badges you had. I will get to the ones in the DLC in a moment, but the original wild area was rather small and offered little to no exploration, but you can see the vision they had. On top of that, it also had the classic route design you've grown to love from the previous titles, in between the various towns and cities across the games. These were smaller areas, designed with a lot more detail and care, and honestly looked quite decent for Switch game standards. The only issue with them was, there was also zero exploration to be done within them either, as they were very straightforward, no secrets, no extra paths, just straight through gameplay. In all the games, you would find a cave across the sea, which you could only explore when you had surfed, but was found early game. A place you had to remember, as you could completely miss it, as it had no relevance to the main story. I feel like they tried to capture this sense of exploration in the wild area, but due to its lack in size, there wasn't much to be done of it. Thankfully, I feel like they improved on this a little with the DLCs that they released. Why I say they should have drawn a line with Sword and Shield has mainly to do with Scarlet and Violet, which by design are way better games than Sword and Shield, but they also make Sword and Shield look a lot better in hindsight, literally, as the performance of Scarlet and Violet is very poor to say the least. The Switch clearly can't handle the way Pokemon envisions its open worlds, and for their customers' sake, they should have stuck to the wild areas design in combination with the classic routes that have load zones. Besides a new concept for traversing the world, nothing much really has changed. A lot of the modern staples of Pokemon games could be found. Mediocre story, uninspiring rival, no challenging battles due to the XP share that you can't toggle, a new uninspired gimmick with Gigantamax and Dynamax, and no real post-game besides shiny hunting and competitive play. Yet the next sentence in the script might confuse some of you and hurt a few others. All of these modern staples are okay. I think it's contrary to popular belief, as Pokemon games are usually labeled as kids games, but Pokemon is more popular amongst adults than kids. Nintendo themselves have done various surveys over the years proving that the majority of their fanbase is above the age of 16, yet they still refuse to make the games more difficult. Why, you ask? Well, their envisioned target audience aren't the adults, as they consider them caught already, but are instead focusing on capturing the younger audience to assure their future. Whether you agree with their approach or not, we have to take that in mind when we tackle all those amazing staples. Sarcasm there for those who can't detect it. Don't worry, we are an American-friendly channel here. So would a kid care about an intricate, deep, philosophical, ethical story told in black and white on the subject on if it's right or not that we catch and battle with Pokemon? No. They want to see cool Pokemon do even cooler things. So a story where you see the box art legendary in the first 15 minutes of playing looking all cool and menacing is more than enough for that audience. Cause I don't know about you, but when I was 10, I was spamming through all dialogue and not reading a single thing. Sure, a better story than, oh, 2 protectors of the realm, a sword and shield Pokemon that belong to 2 brothers, or do they? Well, there's an eco-terrorist that is trying to destroy the region with Eternatus, or whatever the fuck the story was. Doesn't really matter to the target demographic. They looked cool, so it is cool. Now as adults, yes, that story is absolutely shite and has so many plot holes in it, with little to no characters to truly care for, as they are rather bland and boring by design. So I hate to break this next part to you watching, but why the fuck are you playing Pokemon games for a good story? Seriously, get your priorities straight. Pokemon is about catching Pokemon, leveling them up and battling others. Sure, throughout the modern games, this has gotten significantly easier for us adults. But I challenge you to play these games giving no guidance with either your own child at an age they understand the game enough, or with a younger cousin or something, because then you will see that these games aren't as easy for them. Yet again, Game Freak's target audience. Should they give us difficulty settings, the ability to turn off XP share and whatnot to make the games harder? Absolutely. But they are too out of touch to notice, and that will probably never happen. And no, old Pokemon games didn't have good stories either. You're telling me Villain Wants to Turn Everything in Sea or Land was a good story? Or Team Rocket wanting to steal all the Pokemon? No. The only good stories we had were Black and White, and you could argue Sun and Moon. It is just not what Pokemon games are about. Because in reality, Pokemon is about catching the new Pokemons and fighting with them, which honestly, there were quite a few new cool mons added, like the Dreepy line, the Scorbunny line, the Rookidee line, or Wooloo, Dreadnought, Colossal, Toxtricity, just to name a few of the new awesome additions to the franchise. And as always, you have pet designs introduced as well, but that is with every generation. But even those are someone's favorite Pokemon somehow. Now the gimmick mechanic in this game was rather uninspired too. Dynamax and Gigantamax Pokemon, they get big and they have different types of stronger moves, with every type having a certain status effect, like a defense drop to the opponent or attack boost to themselves. These were added to spice up the competitive scene, but I'm not sure if it actually did. In reality, it was just a dollar store version of Mega Evolution, especially the Gigantamaxing, which were alternative designs for a select group of mainly popular Pokemon that got a signature move that was more powerful than the basic ones, instead of different typings and stats like the Mega Swoop. It wasn't great, but I suppose they had to try something to make these games interesting enough to buy and not just same shit, different region type of vibe. And lastly, DLC. The first Pokemon games to do so, and honestly, all I can say is, finally. Funnily enough, people labeled these as cash grabs by Game Freak, which only shows me how out of touch these people are, as they are the opposite of that versus their old business model. Pokemon used to give you the quote-unquote DLC by releasing a third version, your Yellows, Emeralds, Platinums, etc., which was the base game with some changes made here and there, with some added features and bug fixes. Sure, back then it wasn't as easy to drop a patch via the internet, but they are way more cash grabby by design than DLCs are, and not to mention full priced games. These two DLCs went for $30 total. giving you 150 odd Pokemon to play with, 2 new stories, the first one being rather boring but the second one actually rather interesting, 2 new and bigger wild areas that were pretty decently designed, new legendaries with some actual lore, and Dynamax Adventures, a new minigame-esque activity that was great to get some powerful Pokemon, legendaries and shinies. Pretty much TLDR, improving on everything the main game was lacking to an extent. These games are by no means the best games in the franchise, but they aren't as bad as the jaded Pokemon fans think. A game with Mega Evolution, 10 different shiny hunting methods, a balanced competitive scene, the Battle Frontier, toggleable XP share, difficulty settings and 2 regions to explore like in Gold and Silver will most likely never happen. Is this realistic to make? Absolutely. But Game Freak are just as jaded as the fans can be, but more so from a listening to them perspective. But just like I said in my Game Freak video, why the fuck should they care about you? They are the most successful franchise in the world and their games sell extremely well. So clearly, they are doing something right. So Sword and Shield, you're okay. Nothing special, nothing terrible. There are games where you have a new region with cool new Pokemon and enough to do to keep you busy for a while, completing the Pokédex and unlocking everything. Could they have added better shiny hunting methods or Battle Frontier-esque activity? Sure. But they did the bare minimum whilst testing out new ways to further improve the Pokemon franchise with the introduction of the wild area and making competitive play more accessible with the way they handled Pokemon breeding and stat training. So overall, a run-of-the-mill type game and enjoyable for what it was. And that was all for today. I hope you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like as it really helps me out, and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to check the video out on screen. My name is Chev and I'll see you guys in my next video.